What forms of resistance were carried out by women? Although slavery largely disregards women and their contributions, it is crucial to acknowledge the role females played in the Haitian slavery in order to fully understand the measures of resistance applied by slaves. Thus speaking, women were able to resist in ways men couldn't. In African tradition, women passed down and kept alive a disproportionate amount of African culture. They did so through their roles as mothers and healers, daughters and workers. Through their roles in upholding traditional values, women were able to release themselves to their gods and at the same time engage in a form of passive resistance by fight a complete assimilation. In addition, there were two groups of resistance that women displayed: active and passive resistance. Examples of passive resistance include working slow, deliberate carelessness, and feigning ignorance. On the other hand, examples of active resistance were fighting against sexual assault, damaging property, murder, and refusal to work or cooperate. In conclusion, although the role of women is often not mentioned, it is a major factor which largely contributed to Haiti's freedom from bondage.
How did gender influence the experience of a slave? Slave women's reactions to and experience within slavery were different than that of the African male slave. Like her Caribbean male slave counterpart, a Caribbean slave woman actively resisted the repressive and dehumanizing stranglehold of slavery. But enslaved women devised ingenious ways of rebelling that were distinctively their own. These forms of resistance were often actions that related to them particularly as women: resistance against sexual assault, resistance through the passing on of traditions to daughters and other young women, and resistance through the distinctively female activity of marketing present within the Caribbean. But women's active, individualized means of resistance to slavery, such as poisoning the master or members of his family, abortions, or infanticide, have too often been ignored. Historians have valorized the more often violent or forceful acts of resistance attributed to black male slaves, silencing the female voice, which speaks of the enslaved woman's resistance towards the unrelenting bonds of slavery within her enforced domestic, social, and economic role in Caribbean slave society.
What role did gender play in Haitian slavery? A Caribbean slave woman's identity was largely dependent on her fertility. Slave women were kept from engaging in monogamous family relationships and instead treated as objects of reproduction. Their work was also limited to household chores, such as cooking, cleaning, and gardening. Because they were considered physically weaker, in addition, traditional gender roles of the time dictated that a man must be strong, resilient, and unemotional, and at that, they were superior to women. The misconception is still present today. However, the role of gender also played a large role in the safety of the slaves. A female slave was 3 times as likely to be sexually abused. Also, women were more likely to be experience mental trauma due to the fact that immediately after birth, or any time for that matter, male masters were able to strip a woman of her child and sell that for profit. This inhumane act of selling a living, breathing child like some more object caused the downfall of many slave mothers and increased the rates of depression among females.
Were there disadvantages to being one gender as opposed to the other? In my opinion, I think that there are subtle and evident reasons that prove that slavery was worse for women. In general, slave laborers on all plantations were organized into work groups or ateliers, usually 1 or 2 major ones and a smaller one. In the smaller or secondary atelier, then one would find the less robust, the newly arrived Africans not yet integrated into the regular workforce, women in their 7th or 8th month of pregnancy, and others who were nursing infants, as well as children between 8 and 13 who were not yet ready for the major atelier. Upon first hearing this statement, you would think that this supports the claim that men had it harder since they carried out tougher tasks. However, the fetus inside many of these pregnant women carried were mostly, if not always, forcibly planted. Slavery was an experience of mental, emotional, psychological, and physical rape. Planters, the men who often committed the rapes of female slaves, had wives, and these women would have severe animosity when such encounters occurred, whether willingly or forced. This bitterness expressed itself through domestic punishment inflicted by white mistresses on enslaved women. Therefore, the actions taken by the planter class showed a sick mentality and immense hatred they possessed for the blacks, whether male or female. But chaotic punishments and assaults, unmentioned though they were in legal laws or rules, singled out woman for the worst treatment of all slaves. The female slave's misery was endless and her fate uncertain, for she had even more to bear than the male slave.